The ledger was found in 1923, hidden behind a false panel in the demolished Vance mansion on Gaston Street. 76 years after the events it documented, the leather-bound book contained names, dates, and sums of money that made no sense to the construction workers who discovered it. The entries were written in a careful feminine hand, each line recording a transaction that should not have existed. When the foreman brought it to the Savannah Historical Society, the curator read 3 pages before locking it in a vault where it remains to this day. Accessible only by special permission that is rarely granted. The ledger spoke of an auction, but not the kind recorded in Factor's Walk, where cotton and timber changed hands beneath the morning sun. This was something else entirely. A gathering that took place behind closed doors, where the currency was desire, and the merchandise was human beauty itself. What follows is the story of that auction pieced together from the ledger, from letters discovered in estate sales, from the diary of a house servant who could read and write in secret, and from the silence that fell over certain families in Savannah for generations. It is a story about power and its corruptions, about the particular cruelties that flourish in systems built on human bondage, and about what happens when those who have been denied agency find ways to claim it, no matter how twisted those ways might be. This is what happened in Savannah in the spring of 1847, when 6 women of the highest society decided they would no longer accept the limitations placed upon their desires. Margaret Vance stood at the window of her drawing room, watching the rain trace patterns down the glass. Beyond the garden wall, Gaston Street was empty in the afternoon downpour, the cobblestones dark and slick. She was 34 years old, mistress of one of Savannah's finest homes, wife to a cotton factor who spent more time in his factor's work office than in her company, and she was suffocating. The house was silent except for the rain and the distant sounds of the kitchen. Her husband, Richard, would not return until evening. Her 2 children were with their governess in the nursery. The servants moved through the halls like ghosts, trained to be invisible, and Margaret stood at the window, feeling the weight of another empty afternoon pressing down upon her. Like a physical thing. She had been beautiful once, still was by most accounts, though she felt the years beginning their work at the corners of her eyes. Her dark hair was still thick. Her figure still drew glances when she walked through the market. But what good was beauty when it was locked away in a house, displayed only at dinner parties and church services, admired but never truly desired? Her husband touched her once a month, perhaps a perfunctor coupling in the darkness, his mind clearly elsewhere, his body performing a duty. He was not cruel. Richard was never cruel. He was simply absent, his passions reserved for his ledgers and his cotton bales, and his conversations with other men about tonnage and shipping rates. And Margaret was expected to be content with this, to fill her days with needlework and calling cards, with managing servants and planning menus, with the endless small performances of gentility that made up a lady's life. To pretend that she had no desires of her own, no hungers that went unfed. The knock at the door came at precisely 3:00. Margaret turned from the window, smoothing her skirts, composing her face into the pleasant mask she wore for visitors. "Come in." Her housemaid, Betsy, entered with a curtsy. "Mrs. Bowmont is here to see you, ma'am, and Mrs. Caldwell. They say they don't have calling cards, but they hoped you might receive them anyway." Margaret felt a small flutter of curiosity. Catherine Bowmont and Louisa Caldwell were not close friends. They moved in the same circles, attended the same functions, but they had never called together before. And to arrive without cards was unusual, suggesting this was not a social visit. "Show them in," Margaret said, "and bring tea." The 2 women who entered were studies in contrast. Catherine Bowmont was tall and angular with pale blonde hair and ice-blue eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they saw. She was 42, married to a shipping magnate, and known for her sharp tongue and sharper business sense, unusual in a woman whispered about but grudgingly respected. Louisa Caldwell was softer, rounder, with auburn hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had once been pretty but had settled into comfortable middle age. She was 38, married to a judge, and known for her charitable work and her impeccable manners. They settled into the chairs by the fireplace, and for a few moments there was only the ritual of tea, the pouring, the offering of sugar and cream. The small talk about the weather and mutual acquaintances. But Margaret could sense something beneath the pleasantries. A tension in the way Catherine's fingers drummed against her teacup, in the way Louisa kept glancing at the door as if worried about being overheard. Finally, Catherine set down her cup with a decisive click. "Margaret, we've come to speak with you about a matter of some delicacy. What we discuss must remain in absolute confidence." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Of course. Catherine and Louisa exchanged a glance. Then Louisa leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We want to know if you're happy." The question was so unexpected, so direct that Margaret found herself answering honestly before she could think better of it. "No, in your marriage," Catherine pressed. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Richard is a good man. He provides well. He's never raised a hand to me, but he doesn't see me. Not really. I'm a piece of furniture in his house, useful and decorative, but not desired." "Yes," Louisa breathed. "Yes, exactly that." Catherine's smile was thin and knowing. "We are all pieces of furniture, Margaret. Beautiful, expensive furniture that our husbands display to show their wealth and taste, but furniture nonetheless. We are not allowed to have desires of our own. We are not allowed to seek pleasure. We are meant to be ornamental and obedient and content with whatever scraps of attention our husbands deign to give us. But what if we weren't content?" Louisa asked softly. "What if we wanted more?" Margaret looked between them, her heart beating faster. "What are you suggesting?" Catherine reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "There are 6 of us," she said. 6 women who have found ourselves in similar circumstances. We are all married to wealthy, respected men. We are all expected to be satisfied with our gilded cages, and we are all desperately, achingly unsatisfied. She unfolded the paper and handed it to Margaret. It was a list of names written in Catherine's precise hand. Catherine Bowmont, Louisa Caldwell, Elelina Drayton, Judith Abernathy, Sarah Oglethorpe, Margaret Vance. Margaret stared at her own name at the bottom of the list. "You've already included me. We've been watching you," Catherine said bluntly. "At the Havsham ball last month, when your husband spent the entire evening discussing tariffs with Judge Caldwell and barely spoke to you. At the church social, when you stood alone by the refreshment table while Richard talked politics. We've seen the way you look at him hoping for a glance, a word, anything. And we've seen the way he doesn't look back. It should have felt invasive. This revelation that she had been observed, studied. Instead, Margaret felt a strange relief. She was not alone in her misery. She was not the only one who felt invisible. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Louisa glanced at Catherine, who nodded. "We want to create something," Louisa said carefully. "An arrangement that would allow us to experience what our husbands deny us, to feel desired, to exercise choice, to have for once in our lives something that is ours and ours alone. An affair." Margaret whispered, shocked. "No," Catherine said firmly. "Affairs are dangerous. They involve emotions, complications, the risk of genuine attachment. They require secrecy with men who might talk, who might use our indiscretions against us. We would be ruined if discovered, and we would have no power in the situation. No, what we're proposing is something different, something where we maintain complete control." She leaned forward, her eyes glittering. "We're proposing an auction, Margaret. A private auction held in a secure location where we 6 women will bid on something precious and beautiful, something that belongs to us by law, that cannot refuse us, that cannot expose us without exposing themselves to far worse consequences." Understanding dawned slowly, horribly. Margaret felt her stomach turn. "You're talking about slaves." "We're talking about men," Catherine corrected. "Beautiful men, young, strong, carefully selected. Men who will be ours to do with as we please, with no risk of scandal, no possibility of refusal. We will bid on them, purchase them, and they will serve us in whatever capacity we desire." "That's—" Margaret struggled for words. "That's monstrous, is it?" Catherine's voice was cold. "We already own them, Margaret. Our husbands own dozens of slaves, field hands, house servants, stable boys. They are property under the law. What we're proposing is simply a different use for that property. A use that serves our needs instead of our husbands. But to use them in that way," Margaret felt sick. "To force them? They're forced every day," Louisa said quietly. "Forced to work, forced to obey, forced to endure whatever their masters demand. At least in this arrangement, they would be well treated, fed well, clothed well, given comfortable quarters. They would serve in a house instead of breaking their backs in the fields. Some might even consider it a mercy. "You don't believe that?" Margaret said. Louisa looked away. "No," she admitted, "but I believe that we deserve something for ourselves. I believe that we have been denied and diminished and made to feel worthless for so long that we have earned the right to take something back, even if it's wrong, even if it's cruel. Because the cruelty we endure every day, the slow, grinding cruelty of being treated as less than human ourselves, that cruelty has to go somewhere." The room was silent, except for the rain. Margaret looked at the list of names again, at her own name written in Catherine's confident hand. She thought about Richard, about the way he looked through her as if she were glass. She thought about the empty years stretching ahead, about growing old in this beautiful house, surrounded by beautiful things and never once feeling truly alive. How would it work? She heard herself ask. Catherine's smile was triumphant. "We've already begun the arrangements. Eleanor Drayton's husband is traveling to Charleston next month for business. He'll be gone for 3 weeks. Her estate has a carriage house that's been converted to guest quarters. Private, secure, accessible only through the garden. We'll hold the auction there." "And the men," Margaret asked, "where will they come from?" "That's where Judith Abernathy comes in," Catherine said. "Her husband owns a slave trading company. She has access to the manifests, to the records of every slave that comes through Savannah. She'll select 6 men, young, healthy, aesthetically pleasing men who have no families here. No connections that would be noticed if they disappeared from the regular labor pool. Men who can be quietly transferred to our ownership without raising questions." "Our husbands will notice new slaves in the household," Margaret objected. "Not if they're kept separate," Louisa said. "Each of us has property that our husbands rarely visit. Catherine has the summer house on Tybee Island. I have my late mother's cottage on the edge of town. Elelina has the carriage house. You have the old overseer's cabin on your husband's plantation, the one that hasn't been used since he hired the new overseer who lives in town. We can keep them there, visit them when we choose, and our husbands will never know. It was all so carefully planned, so thoroughly thought through." Margaret realized this conversation was not a proposal. It was a recruitment. The decision had already been made. She was simply being invited to join, and if I refuse, she asked. Catherine's expression didn't change. "Then we'll find someone else. But we'd prefer you, Margaret. You're discreet, intelligent, and you understand what it means to be invisible. You won't be careless. You won't let emotion cloud your judgment, and you have the resources to participate fully." "Participate fully," Margaret repeated. "You mean bid." "The auction will be conducted with real money," Catherine explained. "Each woman will bid on the man she wants. The highest bidder wins. The money will go into a collective fund that we'll use to maintain the arrangement, to pay for the men's upkeep, to ensure their silence, to handle any complications that might arise. It's a business transaction, Margaret. Clean, simple, controlled." Nothing about this was clean or simple, but Margaret found herself nodding anyway, found herself saying yes. Found herself becoming complicit in something she knew was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Because Louisa was right. The cruelty they endured had to go somewhere. And if they could not strike back at the men who diminished them, they would strike at those even more powerless than themselves. That was how it worked. Margaret understood now. That was how cruelty perpetuated itself, flowing downward, always seeking someone weaker to bear its weight. She took the list and added her signature beneath her name. Judith Abernathy stood in the warehouse on Factor's Walk, watching the new arrivals being processed. The space was cavernous and dim, lit by shafts of sunlight that fell through high windows, illuminating dust moes, and the faces of frightened men and women who had just endured the nightmare of the Middle Passage. Her husband Thomas owned 3 ships that ran the triangle trade, manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to America, cotton and tobacco back to Europe. It was a lucrative business, and Thomas was very good at it. He was also, Judith had learned over 15 years of marriage, a man who saw human beings as nothing more than inventory. She had accompanied him to the warehouse today, under the pretense of selecting a new housemaid. Thomas had been pleased by her interest in household management, had praised her for taking an active role in such matters. He had no idea what she was really looking for. "These came in yesterday," the overseer was saying, gesturing to a group of men chained together along the far wall. "Mostly field hands, strong backs. We'll sell them at the public auction next week. Are there any house servants? Judith asked, keeping her voice light and disinterested. I need someone refined, someone who can be trained for indoor work. The overseer scratched his chin. Got a few that might suit. There's a young fellow over there named Thomas. Came from a Virginia estate already trained. His master died and the widow sold off the household staff. Judith followed his gesture to a young man sitting apart from the others. He was perhaps 25 with dark skin and features that would have been called handsome by any standard. His clothes, though worn, were of better quality than the others, a sign that he had indeed been a house servant. He sat with his back straight, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the floor. May I speak with him? Judith asked. The overseer shrugged. If you like, ma'am. But he's not for sale separately. He's part of a lot that's already been claimed by the Hutchinson plantation. Judith felt a flicker of frustration. Surely an exception could be made for the right price. Well, now that would be up to Mr. Abernathy, ma'am. He handles all the transactions. Of course, Judith said smoothly, I'll speak with my husband. She moved through the warehouse, studying the men with a critical eye that made her feel sick, even as she employed it. She was looking for specific qualities, youth, physical beauty, a certain bearing that suggested intelligence and adaptability, men who could be trained, who could be controlled, who could serve the purpose Catherine had outlined. It was monstrous work, but Judith had learned long ago that survival in her world required a certain capacity for monstrosity. She found 3 more possibilities. A man named Samuel, perhaps 30, with striking features and a quiet dignity despite his chains. A younger man called Elijah, no more than 22, with golden brown skin and eyes that held a spark of defiance. And a man whose name she didn't catch, tall and broad-shouldered, who watched her with an expression she couldn't read. By the time she left the warehouse, she had a list of 6 names. She would speak with Thomas tonight, would use her Welly influence to ensure these particular men were diverted from their intended destinations. It would require careful manipulation, but Judith had become an expert in managing her husband's decisions while making him believe they were his own. That evening in the privacy of their bedroom, she broached the subject carefully. Thomas, I've been thinking about the household staff. We could use more men for the heavy work. Moving furniture, maintaining the grounds. I saw several at the warehouse today who might be suitable. Thomas was already half asleep, exhausted from a day of business. M talked to the overseer. Get whoever you need. Some of them are already allocated to other buyers, Judith pressed. I would need your authorization to redirect them. Fine, fine. Write up what you want and I'll sign it in the morning. It was that easy. The next day, Judith presented him with a document authorizing the purchase of 6 male slaves for household use, listing their names and the prices she'd negotiated. Thomas signed without reading it carefully, trusting his wife to manage such domestic details. Within a week, all 6 men had been quietly transferred to a holding facility that Catherine had arranged, a small farm outside Savannah, owned by a distant cousin, who asked no questions as long as he was paid. The women met there on a gray afternoon, ostensibly for a charitable visit to inspect conditions for the enslaved workers. In reality, they had come to see what they had purchased. The 6 men stood in a line in the barn, confusion and fear evident on their faces. They had been cleaned, given new clothes, and told only that they were being evaluated for special household positions. They did not yet understand what was really happening. Margaret stood with the other women, her stomach churning as she studied the men. They were indeed handsome. That had been the primary criterion for selection. But they were also human beings with thoughts and feelings and lives that had been stolen from them. And now, those lives were being stolen again in a different way. They'll do, Catherine said crisply, walking down the line like a general inspecting troops. Judith, you've done well. These are exactly what we need. What happens now? Elelina Drayton asked. She was the youngest of the group, only 28, with dark hair and a nervous manner. Her husband was twice her age, a plantation owner who treated her like a child. Now we prepare them, Catherine said. They need to understand their situation, their duties, and the consequences of disobedience. They need to be trained. Trained? Sarah Oglethorpe's voice was faint. She was 35, pale and thin, married to a banker who had not touched her in 3 years. To serve us, Catherine said impatiently, to be pleasing, obedient, discreet. This isn't complicated, ladies. They're slaves, training them is what one does. But it was complicated, Margaret thought. It was deeply, horribly complicated because what they were training these men for was not ordinary service. They were training them to be objects of desire, to perform intimacy without consent, to pretend to want what they could not refuse. It was rape. That was the word Margaret's mind shied away from, but it was the truth. What they were planning was rape, dressed up in the language of ownership and property rights. And yet, she did not walk away. None of them did. Over the next 3 weeks, the women visited the farm regularly, always in pairs, always with the excuse of charitable work. They spoke with the men, assessed their temperaments, began the process of conditioning them to their new roles. Thomas, the house servant from Virginia, was quiet and watchful. He answered questions politely, performed tasks efficiently, and revealed nothing of his inner thoughts. Samuel was older, more resigned. He had been enslaved his entire life, had learned to survive by making himself useful and invisible. Elijah, the youngest, still had fire in his eyes. He obeyed, but there was resistance in every line of his body. The others, Caleb, Daniel, and Joshua, fell somewhere in between, each coping with their situation in their own way. Margaret found herself drawn to Thomas. There was something in his careful composure, in the way he held himself apart, that reminded her of herself. She wondered what he had been before this, what dreams he might have had, what person he might have become if he had been born free. But she did not ask. To ask would be to acknowledge his humanity too fully, and that would make what they were planning impossible. The auction was set for the first week of May to be held in Eleanor Drayton's carriage house, while her husband was in Charleston. The women would gather, the men would be presented, and the bidding would begin. And Margaret would participate, because she had already crossed the line that separated the merely unhappy from the truly monstrous. The carriage house had been transformed. Eleanor Drayton had outdone herself, turning the simple structure into something resembling a private salon. Heavy curtains covered the windows, blocking any view from outside. Candles provided soft, flattering light. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle facing a small raised platform. A table held wine and delicate refreshments, as if this were an ordinary social gathering. Margaret arrived at dusk, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had told Richard she was attending a ladies' prayer meeting, and he had barely looked up from his newspaper to acknowledge her departure. The other women were already there, dressed in their finest gowns, as if for a ball. Catherine Bowmont stood near the wine table, her posture regal and commanding. Louisa Caldwell sat in one of the chairs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Eleanor Drayton fluttered nervously around the room, adjusting curtains and rearranging refreshments. Judith Abernathy stood by the door, her face expressionless. Sarah Oglethorpe sat apart from the others, staring at nothing. Margaret Catherine greeted her warmly. "We're nearly ready to begin." "Please have some wine, settle your nerves." Margaret accepted a glass but didn't drink. Her nerves were beyond settling. At precisely 8:00, Catherine called them to order. "Ladies, please take your seats. We have important business to conduct tonight." They arranged themselves in the chairs, and Margaret was struck by the absurdity of it. 6 wealthy white women in silk and jewels gathering in secret to purchase human beings for their pleasure. It was grotesque. It was evil. And yet no one stood up and left. Catherine took her position at the front of the room. "Before we begin, let us review the rules. Each of us has brought funds to bid. The bidding will start at $500 and increase in increments of no less than $50. The highest bidder for each man will take ownership. The money will be pulled and used to maintain our arrangement." "Is this understood?" Nods all around. "The men have been prepared," Catherine continued. "They understand that they are to be household servants of a particular kind. They understand that discretion is absolutely required. They understand the consequences of disobedience." "What consequences?" Eleanor asked nervously. Catherine's smile was cold. "Sailed to the deep south, the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where the life expectancy is measured in years rather than decades. They know that cooperation means a relatively comfortable existence. Resistance means a death sentence. It's quite simple." Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. This was coercion of the most brutal kind. Obey or die, and they were all complicit in it. "Let us begin," Catherine said. "The first man brought in was Caleb. He was perhaps 28 with dark skin and a powerful build. He stood on the platform, his eyes fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched. "Caleb is a field hand," Catherine announced, reading from a card. "Strong, healthy, experienced in physical labor. He has been examined by a physician and found to be in excellent condition." "Shall we start the bidding at $500? The auction proceeded with horrifying efficiency. Judith bid 600. Sarah countered with 650. Elelena, her voice shaking, offered $700. In the end, Sarah won with a bid of $900. Caleb was led away and Daniel was brought in. The process repeated, then Joshua. Each man stood on the platform while the women examined them like livestock, discussing their merits and flaws, bidding with money that represented months or years of their husband's income. Margaret bid on none of them. She sat frozen in her chair, watching the nightmare unfold, unable to participate but equally unable to stop it. Then Thomas was brought in. He walked onto the platform with his head up, his bearing dignified despite the circumstances. His eyes swept across the women, and for just a moment his gaze met Margaret's. She saw intelligence there, and anger carefully controlled, and something else, a kind of weary understanding, as if he knew exactly what was happening and had already resigned himself to it. Thomas, Catherine Reed, is a trained house servant. He can read and write, which is unusual and valuable. He has experience serving in refined households. He is 26 years old and in perfect health. "Shall we begin at 500? 600? Louisa said immediately, 700. Judith counted. Margaret found herself raising her hand. 800. The other women looked at her in surprise. It was the first time she had bid. 900, Catherine said, her eyes narrowing. 1,000. Margaret heard herself say. The room fell silent. $1,000 was an enormous sum, more than most skilled slaves sold for at public auction. Catherine studied her for a long moment, then smiled slightly. It seems Margaret has found what she wants. Any other bids? No one spoke. Sold to Margaret Vance for $1,000. Thomas was led away, and Margaret sat trembling, wondering what she had just done. She had not planned to bid. She had not wanted to participate, but something in Thomas's eyes had compelled her. Some recognition of shared captivity, and now she owned him. The final two men were auctioned, Samuel going to Catherine for $800 and Elijah to Louisa for $750. When it was over, Catherine collected the money and dismissed the men to their temporary quarters. Then she turned to the women with a satisfied smile. "Congratulations, ladies. We have successfully completed our transaction. Your property will be delivered to your designated locations tomorrow. Remember, absolute discretion is required. These men exist only for us. No one else can know." They left separately, slipping away into the night like conspirators because that was what they were. Conspirators in a crime that had no name, that was perfectly legal under the law, but morally indefensible. Margaret rode home in her carriage. The $1,000 she had spent weighing on her conscience far more than the money itself. She had purchased a human being, she had reduced a man to property. And tomorrow that man would be delivered to the old overseer's cabin on Richard's plantation, where she could visit him whenever she chose. She had gotten what she wanted. Power, control, the ability to be desired rather than ignored, and it felt like ashes in her mouth. The cabin sat at the edge of the pine woods, a half-mile from the main plantation house. It had been built for the overseer 20 years ago, but when Richard hired a new man who preferred to live in town, the cabin had been abandoned. It was small but well-built, with 2 rooms and a fireplace, isolated enough for privacy, but close enough to be accessible. Margaret had it cleaned and furnished simply. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a washstand. She had supplies delivered: food, clothing, blankets, lamp oil. She told the house servants that the cabin was being prepared for a new field supervisor, and no one questioned her. Thomas was brought there on a gray morning in Midday. Margaret watched from a distance as he was escorted to the cabin by one of Judith's men, who unlocked his chains and left him there with brief instructions. Stay in the cabin. Wait for Mrs. Vance. Obey her completely. Then Margaret was alone with the knowledge of what she had done. She did not visit the cabin for 3 days. She told herself she was busy, that there were household matters to attend to, that she needed time to think. In truth, she was terrified of what she had become, of what she was expected to do, of facing the man whose life she now controlled. But on the fourth day, she could delay no longer. She told Richard she was visiting the plantation to inspect the spring planting, and he nodded absently, already absorbed in his ledgers. She rode out in the afternoon, her heart pounding with each step of her horse. When she reached the cabin, she dismounted and stood for a long moment, gathering her courage. Then she knocked. "Come in," Thomas's voice called. She entered to find him standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned when she entered, and his face was carefully blank. "Mrs. Vance," he said quietly. "Thomas." Her voice came out as barely a whisper. They stood looking at each other, and Margaret felt the full weight of the power imbalance between them. She could order him to do anything, and he would have to obey or face consequences too terrible to contemplate. He had no choice, no agency, no escape, and she had put him in this position. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally, the words tumbling out. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say or do. I don't know why I bid on you. I don't know what I want." Thomas's expression didn't change. "You want what the others want. I expect what white women always want from men like me, something you can't have from your husbands, something forbidden." His voice was level, but there was an edge to it, a carefully controlled anger. "I'm not like the others," Margaret protested weakly. "Aren't you?" Thomas moved away from the window, and Margaret had to resist the urge to step back. "You paid $1,000 for me, Mrs. Vance. You own me. You can do whatever you want with me, and I have no say in the matter. That makes you exactly like the others. I won't force you," Margaret said desperately. "I won't make you do anything you don't want to do." Thomas laughed a bitter sound. "I don't want to be here at all, Mrs. Vance. I don't want to be enslaved. I don't want to be property. I don't want to be at the mercy of people who see me as less than human. But I don't have a choice about any of that, do I?" Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "No, you don't, and I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry. Your sorry doesn't change anything." Thomas turned back to the window. "You want to know what you're supposed to do? You're supposed to use me however you see fit." "That's what I'm here for. That's what you paid for. I can't," Margaret whispered. "Then why am I here?" It was a question she couldn't answer. She stood in the cabin, facing the man she had purchased, and realized she had made a terrible mistake. She had thought that owning someone would give her power, would make her feel less invisible, less diminished. Instead, she felt smaller than ever, crushed under the weight of her own cruelty. "I'll make sure you're comfortable," she said finally. "I'll bring you books if you'd like, better food, anything you need." "I need my freedom," Thomas said flatly. "I can't give you that." "Then you can't give me anything that matters." Margaret left the cabin feeling worse than when she had arrived. She had thought she understood what she was doing, but she had been fooling herself. There was no way to make this arrangement acceptable, no way to soften its fundamental evil. But she could not undo it. Thomas was her property now, registered in her name, his fate tied to hers. If she tried to free him, questions would be asked. The other women would be exposed, and Thomas himself would likely be recaptured and sold south. His punishment for being part of an arrangement he had never chosen. She was trapped by her own actions, and so was he. Over the following weeks, Margaret visited the cabin regularly, bringing supplies and trying to establish some kind of relationship that was less monstrous than the one they had been forced into. She brought Thomas books from her own library, volumes of poetry, history, philosophy. She brought him better food than the standard rations. She asked him about his life before, and slowly, reluctantly, he began to tell her. He had been born free in Philadelphia, the son of a freed slave and a white seamstress. He had been educated, had learned to read and write, had worked as a clerk in a shipping office. Then, when he was 22, he had been kidnapped by slave catchers who forged papers claiming he was a runaway. He had been sold south, his protests ignored, his freedom stolen. For 4 years, he had been enslaved in Virginia, serving in a household where he was valued for his education and his ability to manage accounts. When his master died, he had hoped the widow might free him, might acknowledge the injustice of his enslavement. Instead, she had sold him to pay her debts. And now he was here in a cabin in Georgia, owned by a woman who claimed to be sorry, but who had still purchased him like livestock. "Why did you bid on me?" he asked one afternoon when Margaret had brought him a new book. She considered the question carefully. "Because you looked at me," she said finally. "During the auction, you looked at me, and I saw that you understood. You knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be treated as less than human. And I thought maybe we could understand each other, Understanding doesn't change the fact that you own me, Thomas said. No, Margaret agreed. It doesn't, but maybe it means I won't use that ownership the way the others will. The others, Thomas repeated. The other women. What are they doing with the men they bought? Margaret looked away. I don't know, we don't discuss it. But that was a lie. The women met regularly, ostensibly for their prayer group, and they talked. They talked about their purchases with a mixture of satisfaction and shame, describing their visits to the cabins and cottages where they kept their property. Catherine was coldly pragmatic about it. Samuel served her exactly as she demanded, and she rewarded his obedience with better treatment. It was a transaction, she said, no different from any other. Louisa was more conflicted. She visited Elijah often, but seemed unable to actually consummate the arrangement. She brought him gifts, talked to him for hours, and then left without touching him. The other women mocked her gently for her weakness. Elelena had thrown herself into the arrangement with an almost desperate enthusiasm, visiting her cabin 3 or 4 times a week. She spoke of Daniel with a possessiveness that made Margaret uncomfortable. Judith was silent about her activities, and no one pressed her. Sarah had stopped coming to the meetings. When Catherine sent a note inquiring about her welfare, Sarah replied that she was unwell and needed time to recover. And Margaret continued her visits to Thomas, bringing books and food and conversation, trying to create something that was less horrible than what they had been forced into and failing utterly, because there was no way to make it less horrible. The fundamental fact remained. She owned him, and everything that passed between them was poisoned by that ownership. The first sign that something was wrong came in late June, when Sarah Oglethorpe's body was found in the Savannah River. The official story was that she had fallen from the dock while taking an evening walk, struck her head, and drowned. It was a tragedy. The newspaper said a terrible accident that had taken a beloved member of Savannah society. But the 5 remaining women knew better. They gathered at Catherine's house the day after the funeral, their faces pale and drawn. She killed herself, Louisa said flatly. She couldn't live with what we'd done. We don't know that, Elena protested. It could have been an accident. She left a note, Judith said quietly. Her maid found it and brought it to me before anyone else could see it. She knew I would understand. What did it say? Margaret asked. Judith reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded piece of paper. She read aloud. I cannot bear the weight of what I have become. I thought I could separate myself from my actions. Could pretend that what we did was justified by our own suffering. But I was wrong. There is no justification. There is only sin, and I am drowning in it. May God forgive me, for I cannot forgive myself. The room was silent. She was weak, Catherine said finally. She couldn't handle the moral complexity of our situation. Moral complexity. Margaret's voice rose. We purchased human beings to use for our pleasure. There's no complexity about it. It's evil, and Sarah knew it, and she couldn't live with being evil. Then perhaps she made the right choice. Catherine snapped. If she couldn't maintain discretion, if she was going to become a liability, then it's better that she's gone. How can you say that? Louisa whispered, horrified. Because it's true. Our arrangement depends on absolute secrecy. If Sarah had confessed, if she had exposed us, we would all be ruined. Our families would be destroyed. Our husbands would divorce us, and we would be left with nothing. So yes, in a terrible way, her death protects us. It protects us, Margaret repeated slowly. Sarah is dead. And all you can think about is how it protects us. What else should I think about? Catherine demanded. Should I wallow in guilt? Should I flagellate myself for my sins? That won't bring Sarah back. It won't change what we've done. The only thing we can do now is ensure that her death wasn't in vain, that our secret remains safe. But the secret was already beginning to unravel. A week after Sarah's death, Caleb disappeared from the cottage where she had kept him. The women learned of it when Catherine's man went to check on the property and found the cottage empty, the door standing open. Caleb gone. He's run away, Catherine said at their next meeting. We need to find him before he talks. How? Elelena asked. We can't report him as a runaway without explaining where he was and why. We'll have to search quietly, Judith said. Use our own resources, offer a private reward for information. But Caleb was not found. He had vanished into the network of free black communities and underground railroad stations that existed even in the Deep South. Helped by people who asked no questions about where he had come from or what he had endured. His disappearance terrified the women. If he told anyone about the auction and the arrangement, they would be exposed. And while the law might not punish them for what they had done to enslaved men, society would. They would be ostracized, ruined, their families destroyed by scandal. The meetings became tense, filled with accusations and paranoia. Catherine blamed Judith for not securing Caleb properly. Judith blamed Sarah for creating instability with her suicide. Elelina blamed everyone for getting her involved in the first place. And Margaret sat silent, wondering when it would all come crashing down. The answer came in August, when Louisa Caldwell's husband discovered Elijah in the cottage. Judge Caldwell had decided to surprise his wife with a visit to her late mother's property, thinking he might inspect it with an eye towards selling. He arrived unannounced and found Elijah there, well-fed and well-locked, living in comfort that was unusual for an enslaved person. Fuhlt tried to explain it away, said she had taken pity on the young man, had given him light duties maintaining the property. But Judge Caldwell was not a fool. He saw the way Elijah looked at his wife, saw the fear in Louisa's eyes, and he understood. He did not confront her immediately. Instead, he began investigating, asking quiet questions, examining records, and slowly, piece by piece, he uncovered the truth. The women learned of it when Catherine received a visit from Judge Caldwell in early September. He came to her house, was shown into her drawing room, and presented her with a ledger, the same ledger that would be found 76 years later behind a false panel. "I know what you've done," he said simply, "all of you. The auction, the purchases, the arrangement, I have documentation. I have testimony from the men you purchased. I have enough evidence to destroy every family involved." Catherine's face went white. "What do you want?" "I want it ended," Judge Caldwell said. "Immediately, the men will be sold legitimately through proper channels to buyers far from Savannah. You will never speak of this again, and you will pray that I choose to keep your secret." "And if we refuse," Catherine asked, though her voice shook, "then I will expose you. I will bring charges. I will ensure that every detail of your depravity is made public. Your husbands will divorce you. Your children will be taken from you. You will be cast out of society and left with nothing. Is that what you want?" It was not, and so the women agreed. Over the next 2 weeks, the men were quietly sold. Samuel was sent to a plantation in Alabama. Daniel went to a farm in Tennessee. Joshua was sold to a merchant in New Orleans. Elijah was sent to a textile mill in North Carolina, and Thomas was sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. Margaret learned of it when Catherine sent her a brief note. "Your property has been disposed of. The matter is closed." She rode out to the cabin one last time and found it empty. The books she had brought scattered on the floor, the bed stripped bare. Thomas was gone, sold away to a fate she could only imagine, and she had not even been able to say goodbye. She sat in the empty cabin and wept. For Thomas, for Sarah, for all of them, for the cruelty they had perpetrated, and the cruelty they had endured, for the way suffering bred suffering, cascading downward through the layers of power until it crushed those at the very bottom. She had wanted to feel less invisible, less powerless. Instead, she had become a monster. The women never spoke of it again. They continued to move in the same social circles, attended the same functions, smiled, and made small talk as if nothing had happened. But something had changed between them. A shared knowledge that could never be acknowledged, a guilt that could never be confessed. Catherine Bowmont died in 1852 at the age of 47 of a sudden illness that the doctors could not explain. Some said it was her heart, others whispered that she had taken poison, though there was no proof. Louisa Caldwell lived until 1868, but her marriage never recovered. Judge Caldwell treated her with cold politeness for the rest of his life, and when he died, he left the bulk of his estate to their children with only a small allowance for Louisa. Eleanor Drayton's husband divorced her in 1850, citing irreconcilable differences. The real reason was never made public, but Elelina was forced to leave Savannah and live with relatives in Virginia, where she died in obscurity in 1859. Judith Abernathy became a recluse after her husband's death in 1855. She lived alone in their house on Gaston Street, seeing no one, speaking to no one until her own death in 1863. And Margaret Vance continued her life as if nothing had happened. She raised her children, managed her household, and played the role of the perfect wife. Richard never knew what she had done, never suspected the darkness that lived in her heart. But she knew, and the knowledge haunted her for the rest of her life. She thought often of Thomas, wondered what had become of him, whether he had survived the brutal conditions of the Mississippi cotton plantations. She imagined him sometimes still alive, still enduring, carrying the memory of what had been done to him. She hoped he had escaped, had found his way north to freedom. But she knew the odds were against it. In 1865, when the war ended and slavery was abolished, Margaret was 52 years old. She read the news of emancipation with a mixture of relief and despair. The system that had enabled her crime was finally ending. But it was too late for Thomas, too late for all the men whose lives they had destroyed. She lived until 1878, dying at the age of 65. In her final days, delirious with fever, she spoke Thomas's name over and over, begging for forgiveness that would never come. The ledger remained hidden in her house, a record of sins that no one wanted to acknowledge. When the house was demolished in 1923, the construction workers who found it could not understand what they were reading. The entries made no sense. Women's names, men's names, sums of money, dates, and locations. The curator who locked it away understood. But he chose silence, chose to protect the reputations of families who still lived in Savannah, chose to bury the truth rather than expose it, because that was how such things were handled. The crimes of the powerful were hidden, forgotten, erased from history. And the victims, the men who had been bought and sold and used and discarded, they disappeared without a trace. Their stories lost, their suffering unrecorded except in that ledger locked away in a vault, waiting for someone brave enough to read it and tell the truth. The ledger contains 73 pages of entries written in Catherine Bowmont's precise hand. It records every detail of the arrangement. The names of the women, the names of the men, the amounts bid, the locations where they were kept, the dates of visits, and finally the dates and prices of their sales. It also contains something else, a single page in different handwriting added sometime after the main entries. The handwriting is masculine, educated, careful. It reads, "My name is Thomas Freeman. I was born free in Philadelphia in 1821. I was kidnapped and enslaved in 1843. I was purchased by Margaret Vance in 1847 and sold to a Mississippi plantation in 1849. I escaped in 1863 and made my way north. I am writing this so that someone someday will know what happened. So that the women who did this will not be remembered as innocent victims of their time, but as perpetrators of cruelty. So that the men who suffered will not be forgotten. This is the truth." Remember it, the page is dated 1870 and it is signed with Thomas's full name. He survived against all odds. He survived the plantation, survived the war, survived long enough to find the ledger and add his testimony to it. What happened to him after that? No one knows. There is no record of a Thomas Freeman in Philadelphia or anywhere else in the North after 1870. He vanished into history, his fate unknown. But his words remain, locked in a vault in Savannah, a testament to what happened in the spring of 1847, when 6 women decided that their suffering justified inflicting suffering on others. The ledger is still there, still accessible to those who request it, but few do. Because the truth it contains is uncomfortable, challenging, impossible to reconcile with the narratives we prefer about the past. We want to believe that the women of that era were powerless, that they were victims of a patriarchal system, that they had no agency and therefore no responsibility. But the ledger tells a different story. It tells a story of women who had power, limited power, constrained power, but power nonetheless, and who used that power not to resist the system that oppressed them, but to oppress others even more vulnerable than themselves. It is a story about how cruelty flows downward, how the oppressed become oppressors when given the chance, how suffering does not ennoble but often corrupts. It is a story that needs to be told especially though it makes us uncomfortable, because the only way to prevent such horrors from happening again is to acknowledge that they happened in the first place, to look unflinchingly at the darkness in our history and in ourselves, and to choose differently. The ledger waits in its vault, holding its secrets, holding its truth, waiting for us to be brave enough to read.